So, dear friends, welcome to the Cervantes Institute. And I'm very honored and happy to welcome you to this conference on occasion of the Spanish Presidency of the European Union Council and the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is part of the European Union presidency, rotating president that Spain holds from July till December. So we are in December. It's one of our most important public diplomacy events. And I should like to start by thanking Vania Lorenzo, who put this event together, invited you, and made sure everything went swiftly and plain sailing. I also would like to thank from the outset the embassies with which we have decided to embark ourselves on this endeavor. The Japanese embassy, the embassy of Ukraine, the embassy of Lithuania, of Brazil, and the United States of America. We wanted to showcase the fact that human rights are universal rights, and so that Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe cooperate for this is, to me, a great success. We didn't want to have a Spanish EU presidency or a European or a Western approach to human rights. I think it's important to have what is now called the Global South. The Declaration has stood as a beacon of hope and has guided us through turbulent times, reminding us of our shared humanity and the imperative to uphold rights and dignity of every person. It is still a testament to the enduring power of collaboration and empathy. However, our world today is besieged by a compendium of distressing issues and encroach upon these principles. The war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, Israel, is constantly in our minds, but so is Sudan, so is Congo, so is Yemen. Human rights are being violated and the civilian population is suffering in all these places. The Spanish government has stood resolutely behind the government of Ukraine and condemned the loss of lives in the civilian population in both Israel and Gaza. Conflict zones and consequent egregious violations of basic rights are unfortunately observed, Ukraine and the Middle East, but also beyond. They bring about an alarming loss of life, widespread displacement, and the harrowing destruction of entire communities. This crisis, whether they find space on our news cycles or not, demand our sustained attention and unwavering action. The alarming trend of backsliding on human rights protection, often shielded by a selective attention, is a concern. While conflicts in certain regions dominate headlines, equally grave situations in places like Sudan and the plight of its neighboring countries remain forgotten. The humanitarian crisis with Sudan's borders and across its neighboring regions, characterized by violence, displacement, and dire humanitarian needs, requires urgent global attention and concerted effort to alleviate the suffering of millions. I also think it's now appropriate to mention journalists and defenders of human rights who are at the forefront of this task to uphold the declaration in their countries and worldwide. Additionally, the treatment of women in Afghanistan, the first misogynic state as such, the mistreatment of minorities and immigrants, and the rise of authoritarian tendencies in various governments pose significant challenges to human rights worldwide. These instances underscore the necessity of a collective focus and unwavering advocacy for those rights where they are jeopardized. And I have in mind now, the latest declaration in Russia against the LGBT plus communities, describing, activism in human rights, gender, and LGBT as terrorism. As COP28, the UN Climate Change Conference, is presently held in the United Arab Emirates, the intricate link between climate change and human rights cannot be overstated. Environmental degradation, exacerbated by climate change, imposes disproportionately adverse effects on vulnerable populations. The necessity arises not just to protect their rights, but to strive for climate justice and endorse sustainable practices that safeguard both our planet and its inhabitants. Displaced individuals, and this is the link of human rights and migration, often endure discrimination, exploitation, and lack of basic resources while navigating unfamiliar territories. In the quest for safety and stability, immigrants encounter bureaucratic hurdles, detention centers, and at times hostility from their communities of welcome. This experience underscores the urgent need for comprehensive policies that prioritize human rights, compassion, and sustainable solutions for those uprooted by conflict and climate change. And the West has no moral high ground to boast in this matters as the rest, We know what the tragedy goes on in the Mediterranean, from Lampedusa, Lesbos, the border in Melilla in Spain, but equally, in Rio Grande, and the deportation of people to Rwanda. These are things that are every day in the newspaper and speak of the tragedy of migration and the lack of respect for their human rights. Technological advancements also, while heralding progress, present an important challenge. Issues pertaining to digital rights, privacy concerns, and the escalating impacts of emerging technologies on civil liberties necessitate our vigilant oversight. Our aim should be to foster a responsible and inclusive use of technology while preserving individual freedoms. This is closely linked to the phenomenon of disinformation and misinformation, and this is why we have the second panel on the news. Erosion of trust in traditional sources of information, coupled with the pervasive reach of social media, renders individuals vulnerable to manipulation, thereby undermining the foundation of our rights. As we look to the future, let us recommend ourselves to the ideals set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let us stand united in our pursuit of a world where every individual can live with dignity, equality, and freedom. And on an optimistic note, I should like to welcome also members of the Frontline Defenders, an Irish NGO in the audience today amongst us, and the Director of Human Rights from the Department of Foreign Affairs of Ireland. Spain is working together with them on Latin American countries on human rights. I think, the North Star for us should be what happened in the 40s when this declaration took hold. And remember what Albert Einstein, what Bertrand Russell, what Maritain, or in the long past of Spain, what Vitoria and Montesinos did to proclaim human rights in their midst and at their time. The challenges are very high, but they're not unsurmountable, and I think we are here today to make sure that this human rights declaration prevails in a time of turbulent conflicts, and that we all uphold the necessity, to go on further and address issues such as the ones I've mentioned on gender, migration, and climate change. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today, and thank you very much for Ian, an ambassador of Spain, to get me associated for this very important event and recognize the my colleague ambassador here, there, and supporting this event as well. I would like to say a few words about the human rights, but because and the democracy as well, because Japan used to be no, not finished yet, because we are in the December and we continue to be assuring the presidency of G7. So I would like to make a small contributions to the panelists, that we do have a lot of things that have been done in Japan during the Hiroshima summit. But 75 years has been passed, as said, since the declarations. But the world is still struggling to build the society that everyone can participate fully and equally as set out in the declarations. We need to continue upholding human rights and dignity of all. And as I told you, Japan assumes the presidency of G7 this year. And I would like to briefly remind you some of the points that has been agreed during the summit of Hiroshima regarding the subject of today of human rights and democracy. But well, don't be afraid. You know that the commitment of the leaders is a very long list. And if it touch upon on the serious issues like this, the list is very, very long. But today, I just want to mention 3 points that might be interesting for you to review it. The first one is that G7, we committed to listen to those who are seeking to defend and promote human rights. So this is a very important point coming from the first paragraph on the issues, because we want to listen really those who are really on the ground and doing, protecting and defending and promoting the human rights. So in this aspect, this is why I welcome the opportunity like today, gathering panelists from diverse backgrounds. Next, human rights and business. Yes, this is one point that has been mentioned during the Hiroshima summit. We will strengthen our cooperation, collective efforts so that respect for human rights will be ensured in business activity and global supply chain. And very quickly, to end my remarks on democracy and disinformation, and for the second panel, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Downey here, and we will moderate the second panel. Because Dr. Downey is a multi-talented person, and he is not only moderating today the very difficult issues of democracy and disinformation, but when I met him, we talk about Japanese politics, Japan diplomacy, because Professor Downey is well known in Japan to be the leading figures of the Japanese modern politics. So having said that, I would like to remind you what we did and at the occasion of the summit on democracy and disinformation. We will promote 3 informations: fact-based informations, quality informations, trustworthy informations. We will increase cooperation with government and non-government partners from all regions who share the determination to promote access to such information. Fact-based, quality, trustworthy information. I hope that this quick review of what we've done in Hiroshima will be helpful to animate the discussion. Thank you very much.
And now we have our keynote address by Pat Cox, a former president of the European Parliament. Please.
Buenos dias a todos. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to begin by thanking His Excellency Ambassador de la Riva for his invitation to address you this morning, marking, as is evident, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also to thank all of those ambassadors who are here, in particular those who share this platform with you. And indeed, Ambassador, I think you put your finger on it, that they speak to the universality of the Declaration, coming from North America, South America, Asia to Africa, Europe, and of course, the Ukrainian ambassador is present, which reminds us also of one of the numerous issues that you mentioned to us. The Declaration itself is a milestone document in human civilization and marked a high point of hope for a new beginning after the ravages of the Second World War by promulgating universal fundamental rights to equality, freedom and justice based on the individual human dignity of each person and irrespective of their culture, political system or religion. This was expressed extraordinarily succinctly in 30 short articles. It was not a treaty and did not create binding legal obligations, but it has animated, suffused and informed subsequent binding UN conventions, treaties, regional human rights instruments and extensive jurisprudence. The European Convention on Human Rights, for example, which is binding and judiciable, entered into force 2 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and drew its inspiration from it, as is clearly acknowledged in the first 2 considérants of the opening preamble of the European Convention. As I intend later to turn to the question of whether democracy and human rights are in danger, I think it is worth recalling that the human rights agenda has evolved and expanded over time and remains a vital and living corpus of rights that continues to flourish and develop. I take one example of many that you've chosen, Ambassador. The United Nations General Assembly confirmed the universality of the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. The UN Environment Programme reports that in 2022, there were 2,180 climate litigation cases, 17% of those in developing countries, including small island developing states. In a victory for climate justice, the UN Human Rights Commission found that Australian government inaction on climate change violated the human rights of the indigenous population of the Torres Strait Islands and recommended that compensation be paid. The Brazilian Supreme Court has ruled that the Paris Climate Accord is a human rights treaty enjoying supranational effect. 2,000 women in Switzerland have a case before the European Court of Human Rights, having failed before the Swiss courts to vindicate their claim that insufficient government action on climate change violates their right to life and to health. These are but a few of numerous such examples of cases taken at international, regional and national courts and tribunals. Legal actions range from domestic non-enforcement of climate law, litigants who are seeking to keep fossil fuel in the ground, challenges to greenwashing by corporations, corporate liability for climate harm, right down to addressing failures to adapt to the impacts of climate change. My point in making this observation is to insist that even as we correctly will examine the risk that democracy and human rights agenda are under real threat, there is a parallel and counterpart story of an evolving and resilient community of individuals and institutions pioneering new boundaries in the expression of the contemporary evolution of our inherited human rights agenda flowing from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this, of course, includes today the accumulation of evidence and the search for justice for Ukraine and Ukrainians in the light of Russia's war of aggression. Let me turn now, if I may, to the threats to human rights and democracy. I think these are many and varied. There is a resumption of great power competition and rivalry between systems. This is epitomised by the tensions between the United States and China, though it is not confined to them alone. It finds expression in Russia's war of neo-imperial aggression against Ukraine. The post-war liberal order led by the United States is contested. Emerging powers want their place at a multipolar table and a greater say in the shaping of global rules. Russia and China confront what they perceive as the hegemonic West in general and the United States in particular, accusing the latter of pursuing a policy of containment and suppression. The unipolar moment of the United States has ended and was not covered in glory. The presumption that free markets and open democracy were inextricably linked has proven to be elusive. Perceived double standards have constrained the capacity of the West to rally the global South to its cause, though of course policy inconsistency is a habit to which the critics of the West themselves are not immune. The West itself is stressed by political, social and economic cleavages following multiple consecutive crises. The growth of populism, nationalism, nativism, identity politics and culture wars are tokens of an internal schism of contested visions and values. Anti-elite, illiberal, anti-system political candidates and philosophies abound. This poses a question as to whether the West, in terms of inherited normative standards such as liberal democracy, open markets and international cooperation, is becoming less Western, a phenomenon labelled by the Munich Security Conference 2020 as Westlessness, which I thought was rather a clever phrase, derived, of course, from restlessness, which lies underneath it. In short, the world order as we've known it in the West is threatened both from without and within. Part of this may be a cyclical phase in the tide of national affairs, but I believe that it has a more structural feel in terms of international affairs. What is clear is that we've entered a new age of uncertainty. This is a time of spreading nuclear proliferation with diminished and contested strategic weapon safeguards. Global warming is producing weather extremes of growing frequency, intensity and impact in terms of human suffering and loss of biodiversity. No one needs convincing post-COVID-19 of the dramatic and rapid distress triggered by pandemics. The world we live in shares both deep interdependence and deep vulnerability. We may be standing at the threshold of a new multipolar order, but without agreed multilateral norms and rules. Without effective multilateralism, our separate and collective vulnerabilities will increase. A small state like Ireland and a regional polity like the European Union have a deep vested interest in effective multilateralism as beneficiaries of a stable and reasonably predictable normative and institutional order that has sustained peace and delivered prosperity to our region and our country. Recognising that the liberal world order is threatened both from without and within poses the question, what can we do? We in the West cannot choose what others do. We can choose what we do. So it is to the internal dimension of the threat to our values that I now turn. With the benefit of hindsight, I would argue that some Western self-reflection is merited. Inevitably, concerning the liberal world order, as its author, underwriter and sheriff, what the United States does and fails to do is central to any analysis. I believe that critical self-awareness is the pathway to enhancing and strengthening any understanding of who we are and what we do. I invite you to consider with me three aspects of Western power: military power, trade and financial markets. The dramatic events of 9/11 2001 rocked the United States and gripped the world as the death and destruction unfolded before our eyes in real time. The French newspaper Le Monde, in an editorial published 2 days later, captured what I believe all Europeans felt at the time, observing, "Nous sommes tous Américains." A US-led international coalition hunting Osama bin Laden and fighting a war on terror invaded Afghanistan and toppled his host, the ruling Taliban regime, evoking, I would say, more understanding than hostility to the United States. Based on false evidence of weapons of mass destruction, polarizing Allied choice as you are with us or you are against us, declaring that diplomacy had failed, and offering the ultimately delusional promise of bringing democracy to the region, the United States and allies then invaded Iraq, evoking over time more hostility than sympathy. Trillions of dollars were spent. Thousands of US and allied military lives were lost. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi and Afghani military, police and civilian lives were lost. The region is now more unstable than before, and in the case of Afghanistan, has reverted to type under restored Taliban rule, as if the previous 2 decades had never happened at all. In choosing to invade Iraq, neoconservative hubris in the US administration wasted America's unipolar moment. Its essentially unilateralist inspiration was a lesson not lost on dictators and autocrats. It gifted the likes of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and others a stick to beat the West with by launching an invasion that, in the view of the then UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, and I quote, was not in conformity with the UN Charter, close quote. It also, I believe, sowed the seeds of a more isolationist disposition in the domestic politics and the home front in the USA. My conclusion, that seeking to establish a liberal order by imposition has not worked to the benefit of the West. I turn now to markets. The link between open markets, democracy and international cooperation is a key normative aspect of the liberal world order. Back in 2000, the West's bet on China was captured by Bill Clinton's final State of the Union address to Congress, when in essence he argued that China's admission to the WTO would enrich Americans and help convert China to freedom. Less than 2 decades later, Donald Trump, in his inaugural presidential address, blamed trade with China for creating what he called American carnage. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping was tightening the grip of the Chinese Communist Party behind the Great Firewall of China. The bet that enhanced access to global markets would democratize China did not pay off. The ground has shifted from economic embrace to geopolitical great power tension and rivalry. The fate of Taiwan may prove to be its testing ground. My conclusion, a policy of liberal order by presumption has not worked to the benefit of the West. I turn now to economy. After a long period of deregulation and accommodating monetary policy, Western financial markets hit the buffers with the Lehman Brothers collapse in September 2008, and in Europe with the subsequent prolonged Eurozone crisis which followed. Ultimately worthless, collateralized debt obligations, a means of packaging risky mortgage debt into supposedly low-risk investment securities, exploded into a full-blown financial crisis. The biggest welfare checks ever issued on both sides of the Atlantic were written to sustain systemically important banks from collapse. What followed was a period of austerity to correct fiscal imbalances with severe impact at the level of households and firms, and ultimately naive and misplaced faith in the power of competitive markets to correct their own systemic faults was to blame. In terms of risk management, greed conquered prudence. There followed a profound loss of faith in elites and a rise in popular and populist attacks against so-called globalists. My conclusion is that a liberal order expressed through a policy of hyper-deregulation and exaggerated belief in self-correcting markets has not worked for the West itself or its political harmony. This paper argues that we cannot choose in the West what others do, but we can choose what we ourselves do. The most compelling test of what we do is upon us. In truth, the United States was and remains the indispensable anchor of the normative West. And as the war in Ukraine confirms yet again, it is still the arsenal of democracy. What it does matters. Next year's presidential election in the USA is likely to be the most consequential of our lifetimes, not just for the United States, but for the idea of the West itself, its values, norms, aspirations, and choices. In a compelling recent essay in the Washington Post, Robert Kagan argues that Donald Trump is running against the system. If he wins, he will face the fewest constraints ever on a US president, and that the rights of his perceived enemies will be conditional and not guaranteed. Kagan's message and conclusion is that the United States is drifting towards dictatorship. Vengeful narcissism and arbitrary transactionalism as the guiding hand on the tiller of the US ship of state, staffed by insurrectionist conservatives, for me, would be a truly appalling vista. That is a scenario, not a prediction, yet. The candidates have not yet been nominated. Politics is volatile, and such a scenario is by no means certain. But neither is it entirely implausible. This is so because of the level of popular disenchantment with the establishment and the extent of polarization in US politics and public opinion. Should the USA choose to follow this disruptive path, we all will pay a price. Permit me briefly, before I finish, to comment on two contemporary issues. First, we unreservedly condemn the brutal slaughter and rape of innocents and the taking of hostages by Hamas in Israel on October 7. So too, the West urgently must mobilize its collective will and weight to insist on cherishing the life and meeting the humanitarian needs of innocent Palestinian civilians. Secondly, Ukraine has shown enormous courage and resilience in defending its sovereignty and territory in the face of Russian aggression. It must not be abandoned in its hour of need. Failure to address either of these responsibilities today will carry serious costs for the West tomorrow. In conclusion, democracy and human rights are in danger, but in my view, their greatest threats are from within. The single greatest potential threat, unhappily, could arise in the West's anchor state, the United States of America. The dice will be rolled in 11 months' time. Where the United States goes, others follow. The West, as we have known it, has a lot rolling on that dice. And I end with a question. Why should others believe in human rights and democracy if we, their source and loudest proponents, stopped doing so ourselves? Thank you for your invitation and for your attention.
The first panel will start now, and then we won't have a break between the first and the second, just a time for the speakers to move around. Thank you.
So to start this first panel, I'll just perhaps briefly set the scene. As we all know, the United Nations was founded as a concert of the great powers with absolutely no intention of the liberation of the colonies and no intention to give anything away other than control of their own sovereignty. But 3 years later, already in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was exhortatory, as Pat Cox said, not mandatory, a will was shown to try and break that mold and to remake the world on the basis of individual human rights. We will be talking quite a bit, I think, about the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Convention of Human Rights, to just briefly, nothing to do with the EU, same flag but otherwise different. It is 46 member states following the departure of Russia. It is special because for the first time in history, a court was given, an external court was given the power to adjudicate on domestic issues, and individuals were given the right, provided all local remedies had been exhausted, to take their particular case to the European Court of Human Rights. There are now 14,000 cases of individual before the European Court of Human Rights.
75,000.
75,000, whoa, okay. Right, Susan, yes. So I will now introduce the speakers in the order in which they appear in the programme. First of all, we're very happy to have with us Ruairí de Búrca. Ruairí is the head of what used to be called Anglo-Irish Division, but now the Americas, Ireland, UK, and Latin America. And he has a long history in foreign affairs. He has worked extensively in Northern Ireland as Joint Secretary of the Secretariat in Belfast. He has served Ireland and Africa, in Mozambique and other places. He's been the head of Irish Aid for 5 years, and for the last year, he's back in the seat dealing with Anglo-Irish and affairs and beyond. So I'm very happy to have him here. He's very much aware of the complexity of human rights issues and that kind of interface between human rights, justice, and peace. Our second guest is Dr. Mykola Gnatovsky from Ukraine. He's a judge of the European Court on Human Rights in Strasbourg. The technical term is in respect of Ukraine, but of course his role requires impartiality. He was a law professor for many years in Kyiv, in Taras Shevchenko University, dealing with humanitarian law, comparative law, international law. And of course, we all know that international law is something is very fragmented. During the period about 2012 to 21, he was a member and subsequently, for 6 years, the chair of the committee, of the Anti-Torture Committee. and was extremely active in that capacity. Prior to becoming a judge, he was an advisor to Foreign Minister Kuleba, so quite closely involved in the initiatives that Ukraine has taken in relation to the Russian invasion. And he's, generally speaking, an expert on the jurisprudence related to crimes committed in armed conflict. Very happy to have Mykola here. Our third speaker is going to be Dr. Alyson Kilpatrick. Did I give you a doctorate by mistake?
That's fine.
Yeah, well, she's a barrister. She's a barrister in the Bar of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And for many years she has been working on issues of human rights in Northern Ireland, particularly in policing. From 2009 to 2017, she was the independent human rights advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and she monitored the PSNI's compliance with the UK's Human Rights Act. She's authored a number of reports on very delicate subjects, for example, covert operations, the police use of terrorism and security powers to stop, search and question, police detention and minority rights. She's also written a report for the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, which is a human rights approach to policing in Ireland. I take that means for all Ireland, so we're very happy to have the Chief Commissioner with us. Our fourth participant is Dr. Salome Mbugua, and she is a Kenyan national, but has lived in Ireland for 30 years, almost. She is very active in migrant issues, migrant women issues. She's the founder of an organisation called AkiDwA in Dublin, and she's also has been co-president of the European Network of Migrant Women. She is a specialist in women, peace and security, which is an issue that many of us confronted in a United Nations conflict as a result of a resolution at the turn of the century. And she has been heavily involved in affairs in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she also was the Irish chair of the National Committee writing the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. So a very comprehensive panel in front of us. The first person I'm going to invite to speak, obviously, is the person on my left, Rory de Búrca from the Department of Foreign Affairs.
It's on. Okay. Morning, everybody. Thanks, Ken. Just a few thoughts. I think the question that Pat Cox left us with at the end of his speech is actually a really important and pressing question. Important and pressing on the island of Ireland, and I think very important and pressing for the continent of Europe as a whole. And I think the place of the continent of Europe in the world that is very complex and getting more complicated. So why is it important on the island of Ireland? I think, and Alyson will probably pick up on this too, the European Convention on Human Rights was central and is central to the Good Friday Agreement. It helped get us the settlement and the balance that brought us the peace on this island. As part of that agreement, it was agreed between the two governments that Northern Irish law would be always within a European Convention of Human Rights framework. It had to comply. And secondly, as part of the outworkings of that, the UK agreed to incorporate in its domestic law its Human Rights Act 1998 or 1999, the European Convention, which meant that where human rights abuses were alleged to have occurred in Northern Ireland, rather than having to go straight to Strasbourg, there was, for the first time, proper domestic remedy. And that's really important. I think the second reason that it was important on the island of Ireland was it opened up a new framework for policing, particularly in Northern Ireland, but increasingly in the south as well. I'm sure Alyson will touch on that. And I think police reform in Northern Ireland, with the police having been one of the protagonists in the conflict, or perceived to be a protagonist, is one of the great successes and one of the ways in which the legitimacy of the new order there was was achieved. It also allowed for a very substantive reform of the justice sector, which has been really successful, but is not necessarily one that has achieved the attention which perhaps, in my opinion, it deserves. Really important also, in a post-Brexit context, if we think of the Good Friday Agreement as a fabric with a really sort of tightly woven warp and weft of interchangeable things, Brexit was a rip in that fabric, because both the UK and Ireland's joint membership of the European Union, which itself has within it a very strong link to the European Convention on Human Rights, it created an unsettlement within the terms of where we were that hasn't been quite worked through, and specifically in a UK context has opened up a different conversation politically around extraterritorial laws, whether UK is amenable to the jurisdiction of so-called foreign courts and all of that. And that debate, and we see it playing out in today's politics, so I don't want to get too close to what's very pregnant in London, but it has an impact on life today in Northern Ireland, and particularly on one very pressing question, something that we didn't deal with properly in 1998, which is how do we account for the harms that people did to each other during the conflict years, and how do we bring that to a close? And the UK's recent Legacy Act, which wasn't agreed, appears to us to be in tension with the commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights, and that plays into those broader political issues in London. So that's a very sort of difficult scenario. Difficult because obviously the harms that people did to each other, how you navigate killings, murders, how you move to accountability, how you move to apologies, all of that reconciliation piece is a really difficult thing. And it's more difficult the further away you get from, if you want, the compression and the immediacy of having to stop violence. The last point I make on Northern Ireland is that the framework that the European Convention on Human Rights gives, so some rights are absolute, like, effectively the right to a proper investigation of a killing, a murder, that's absolute. But it's a framework for navigating tensions between, for example, privacy and right to freedom of expression. And it's that which allows really difficult issues like the right to parade in Northern Ireland to be addressed. And it gives an objective set of criteria on issues such as that, where identity issues are to the fore and which are emotive almost by design. Final point for me at this stage is we would see that there's almost an umbilical link between how we navigate that sort of rights arena on this island and where we have to go in our foreign policy more generally. As a small island at the edge of Europe, we are best protected within a broader fabric of agreed international law, ways of doing business, mutual respect, and the ability to appeal challenges to a court or to a third-party organisation to find those balances and to find that fairness. And, in a context where international humanitarian law is under strain and was under strain long before Ukraine, long before Israel-Palestine at the moment, but for example in Syria, where the access for aid workers has been challenged. You see that in some of the conflicts as well across the Sahel. Really important that we really interrogate international humanitarian law and its linkage to what we uphold on our continent, so that when we talk values in our foreign policy, we live it in terms of our actions. We tried to do that in our time in the Security Council when we achieved a resolution on access for humanitarian workers in certain situations. That's now under strain in the context of Israel-Palestine. So I think there's a challenge between where we would like to be, keeping those alliances together to ensure that that sense of working together within a shared framework endures, and actually lived reality, so that other people see us living up to the values we profess.
Rory, if I could just ask you a question. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights aspires to be universal, and certainly in terms of the way in which governments respond to it, they often take a pick-and-choose attitude. When they have to defend themselves in the Human Rights Council, they use what's called UN-appropriate language to cover their nakedness. But it's a universal narrative that we all need to promote. Universal narratives are now being challenged because we're all living in digital echo chambers, and social media have cynically fabricated counter-narratives, as we've seen on the streets of Dublin 2 weeks ago. Are the social media making it much more difficult to uphold universal values and our sense of common humanity?
I think it makes it more difficult to have shared narratives. You know, we don't all sit around the television at 7:30 and watch Coronation Street and then talk about it the next day in Ireland and the UK, for example. So narratives generally are more fractured. But I think we have to step back a little bit. I think there can be sometimes a tyranny of the now. I think we look at things like there are other drivers. We're kind of going through 3 or 4 global revolutions at the moment. We do have an information revolution, which is broader than social media, which is changing how people work, how people live. We have climate change. We've had, you know, really rapid globalization. We have, as Pat's, you know, was talking about, effectively the end of American hegemony and a new emerging global order. So in all of that, there's a lot of things in ferment. We probably haven't had as many things in ferment for a very long time. And that, I think, people kind of retreat back into smaller spaces. You know, people are defensive. People are frightened. And I think in that context, there's a very natural human retreat from universality into... Selfishness is probably not the right word, but a more localized expression of need and desire. And historically, these moments have always been moments of opportunity for maybe not always the best actors, you know, not always the best faith actors. So I kind of say the social media phenomenon is probably part of that broader set of global challenges. But then to bring it back to rights, it actually, ironically, makes it much more important for us to articulate that universal basis, but also acknowledge that, you know, even in the best of times, in halcyon days, there are certain cultural specificities in how we choose to emphasize elements of those rights, which we've never really been 100% honest about. So in the West, we tend to prioritize in our discourse the rights of the individual, you know, and if we talk to the Chinese or the Cubans, you know, it's collective rights that get a higher level of articulation. And I don't think we've ever actually navigated that in a subtle a way as we might. So I think we have to recognise that as well as we move forward, while also, I think, acting in a much more thoughtful, visible way to defend the rights as we see them and articulate for them in appropriate forums too.
Thank you very much, Rory. We will now pass to our next speaker, Dr. Mykola Gnatovsky, who is, as I mentioned, a judge on the European Court of Human Rights. So, Dr. Gnatovsky, I pass the microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in front of you here. And thanks a lot to Rory for his thoughts, because I think they resonate very much with what I would like to highlight now. And of course, after such an impressive keynote address by Mr. Cox, I think we all have the same set of questions more or less in front of us. And let me say that the notions of peace and human rights are actually much closer, interrelated, interdependent, that it would have seemed to be the case if one looks at how this has been discussed over many years in international fora. And the Universal Declaration, indeed, that's the occasion for us to meet now, which was proclaimed 75 years ago, was seen as one of the ways to ensure peace. Because the whole concept, of course, was that once we emphasize the rights of individuals, then they would dominate the discourse, then they would prevail over, let's say, geopolitical considerations, they would prevail over certain ideas that were governing international relations in the 19th century, also in the first half of the 20th century, before the Second World War and leading to the Second World War, and of course for many centuries before, at least since the 17th century, the so-called classical international law, the Westphalian system. And it's true, and I absolutely have to concede that there is the dimension of collective rights here, which is also very important. And by the way, it's 75 years of the Universal Declaration on the 10th of December, but it's also 75 years of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide on the 9th of December, one day before the convention was adopted. And genocide is about groups, is about collectivities. So I mean, these concepts were already there, present at the same moment. But what happened next, and that's at least my impression, is that even though the United Nations was very much busy with both the peace dimension and also the human rights dimension, they somehow got completely separated. Well, first of all, it took the United Nations to come to a legally binding instruments in human rights, again, well, 18 years more, until 1966, with the two covenants. But also, even geographically and practically, basically, the matters of war and peace are dealt with in New York, and human rights are dealt with in Geneva. And this is, I would say, this is a schism. This is a real distance. I mean, almost worlds apart. Whereas the real things were being discussed in New York. Well, the general affirmation and everyone's sort of good intentions in terms of human rights were being ventilated in Geneva without much impact on New York, so to say. So that's and this has unfortunately fired back already, among many other things which have been so aptly highlighted by Mr. Cox and also by Mr. Búrca. It's exactly the problem that challenges the universality, the universal protection, and the actual lack of universal protection of human rights. We have plenty of UN treaty bodies, and we have the talk of the necessity to reform those treaty bodies for at least last 40 years, I would say, if not more, leading to nowhere, but being discussed every year, of course, at in Geneva and sometimes in New York as well. So that now, of course, with the events that have been already highlighted by the organizers of the conference in the opening speeches, all these tragedies, and actually having a large-scale territorial war in Ukraine, in Europe, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which is basically aimed very clearly, unequivocally, without any shade of a doubt, to simply destroy another sovereign state, its political independence and its territorial integrity, the very basic notions that underpin the global system, the United Nations Charter, and that is one of the factors contributing to it. Of course, there were other factors. There was this very unfortunate period and full of lost opportunities with the so-called I'm sure it was the case at any given moment, but, well, the so-called hegemony of the United States, and at least this refusal to follow the multilateralism approach, and despite all the efforts of, let's say, coming from the Europe to convince the American friends and partners that multilateralism was important. So all of that, of course, is another dimension to it. But once again, the idea of people like Herr Lauterpacht, for example, that is very much reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that the individual, the value of an individual, the life of an individual, the dignity of an individual, freedom of an individual, that once this is truly adhered to by everyone, that would be the best possible way to prevent wars. Well, this unfortunately has failed, but doesn't mean that this doesn't have to be upheld, also because there have been so many developments in the field of human rights that we do not want to lose in any case. And the examples have been given already by several speakers today. In Europe, it's true. 2 years after the declaration, the convention, a legally binding convention on the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, was signed. 3 years later, it enters into force. It took more time to actually set up a functioning European Court of Human Rights. It took even more time to convince everyone to consent to the jurisdiction of that court, than to transform this court into a permanently functioning court, which only happened in 1998. Well, it's a relatively recent development. 25 years ago, essentially, the 11th protocol to the European Convention was adopted. And that is something that I think needs to be preserved for reasons that you have mentioned, and I think that this is crucial for Ireland and also for the United Kingdom, I dare say, but it's crucial in various parts of Europe. And I would very much like also to pick up your idea that it's the court, the binding court, a court of law in Strasbourg, indeed is the right way to balance these different competing interests, to find a solution that would fit the European values, so to say, and the European community, the larger Europe, the Council of Europe's Europe, not only the European Union Europe. So the European Court is also now seized, as you know, of cases that were rather unique for it. It has to deal with many interstate cases. Basically, it has to fulfill its function in upholding the so-called European public order. Well, essentially, the rule of law at the international level, at least within Europe, and which is very difficult, by the way, for the court, because it's very much streamlined to deal with thousands and thousands of individual applications. And interstate cases is of course, is a very, very complex task, but still it's being handled. And these achievements, they do have to be developed. The new challenges have to be taken into account. Everything that's, the discussion that is going to be held in the second panel, it is very much also in the focus of the European Court of Human Rights attention. And one hopes that the court can be helpful also in challenging, in coping with these challenges. Same goes for environmental concerns. It is very difficult. You know, I'm lucky. For the time being, I'm not sitting in any of the several important environmental cases in the European Court of Human Rights. But as a general comment, I must say that it is extremely difficult to frame these issues in terms of individual rights. Rights protected by the European Convention on Human Rights. So legally, this is an enormous challenge. Well, we'll see how it will be coped with, but that's also true. However, the European Court of Human Rights has already a long time ago recognized that the so-called environmental nuisance or environmental issues, that this can very well be amounting to violation of the right to life or the right to private life and so on. So there's plenty of developments which need to be supported. Europe needs to be stronger. We face such uncertainty also as regards the next year's elections, as mentioned by Mr. Cox, in the United States of America. Well, isn't this one of the reasons why Europe should be more united, why Europe should be stronger, why Europe should be capable of coining its own response to global challenges without that much dependence on what's happening on the other side of the pond? So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mykola. In terms of the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over 4 offences: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Now, I understand with the crime of aggression, it's never been quite possible to get a definition agreed. It has come up again, it's been brought up again with the invasion of Ukraine, and we know that Philip Sands is working very hard to promote the setting up of a Nuremberg-type tribunal. What is your view on a crime of aggression?
Thank you very much, Ken. Well, that's another very important dimension here. As you mentioned, just since the beginning of the large-scale invasion of Russia into my country, and until my election to the court, I served the only way I could helpfully, usefully serve my country, as an advisor to the foreign minister, just on the question of international criminal justice, actually, and the proposal to create the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, which Philip Sands indeed was the first to come up with and publish in Financial Times 4 days after the beginning of the large-scale invasion, on the 28th of February. We worked together with him on the initial steps in the very initial steps here. It's a very sad story because it is also very much indicative of how matters of peace and justice were treated by, well, let me put it very blunt, by the global West. First and foremost, because, or the global North, if you will, because it was the global South who actually insisted on having the crime of aggression included into the list of 4 crimes for which the International Criminal Court would have jurisdiction during the Rome Conference in 1998. But it were the Western states, and in particular the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, who were opposing the International Criminal Court actually acquiring real jurisdiction, workable jurisdiction, fearing that would undermine the monopoly of the Security Council to judge on matters of aggression. And we see how, in inverted commas, efficient the Security Council is now, with the wars that are raging in the world and in Europe. So the definition was agreed then in Kampala, but still, 9 years later. But then, in any case, the real jurisdiction wasn't given to the International Criminal Court, and when it was finally given, it was surrounded by lots of conditions which were extremely hard to meet, almost impossible to meet. So there is no way, unfortunately, unless the Rome Statute is changed seriously, how the International Criminal Court, for example, can deal with the crime of aggression when it comes to the Russian war against Ukraine. So therefore there was this proposal, because indeed coming back to the Nuremberg Tribunal, you mentioned the Nuremberg type, the idea was that, in fact, the crime of aggression is the foundation for all other crimes. Because the war starts, then, of course, it means that there is the large-scale neglect for human life, there is large-scale neglect for individual rights, all of them, or every single of them. So the crime of aggression needed to be addressed in the first place. But of course, with the events, such as events already mentioned in Iraq and elsewhere, there was huge reluctance from the key actors to do anything on the subject. And we are still coping with this, trying to cope with this problem. I'm no longer personally involved, but from what I can see, and it's public, and I think it's now the position that the G7 had to adopt, was that, well, again, one has has to be extra cautious, not to create a precedent. God forbid if we do something wrong, then of course it might hit us, and so on. And this is most regrettable. Well, what can I say more? Thank you.
Thank you. Just one very quick question. Going back to your time as president of the Anti-Torture Committee, to give it a short name, you obviously visited lots of prisons, but you also went to detention centres for migrants and asylum seekers. How did you feel about the capacity of European countries to stand up to the human rights standards set out in the Convention in terms of their treatment of migrants?
Well, thank you. Indeed, all the places of detention that I was visiting for 12 years, these are difficult places to visit, but the most difficult ones were the centers where migrants are held. Because when you enter them, you feel the level of desperation that is unprecedented. You don't have that level of desperation even in the worst psychiatric hospitals or in the worst prisons. Because there, people genuinely fail to understand why. Why do they have to be held in detention, often in completely inhuman and degrading conditions, for having committed no crime whatsoever, for not having the right documents to enter the country, for not having the legal basis to stay in the country? Is that a sufficient reason? And the reason why they came to the country was not because they wanted to entertain themselves, not for touristic purposes. They were fleeing poverty, they were fleeing war, they were fleeing all sorts of disasters, all sorts of persecutions, and so on. And then they end up, let's say, in confined in a space in one of the European countries, let's say, that I visited. Was something that is unforgettable. If you can imagine a metal container in summer, 100 square meters area, the living space within this container, containing 130 people inside. So when you open the door, somebody falls out, basically. And they're there for days and months on end, in absolute desperation. So this is one of the most terrible experiences, I must say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mykola. May I now turn to Alyson. Alyson Kilpatrick. Alyson would like to speak on her feet. She's a woman who is quick on her feet.
I find it gives me discipline. If you give me a seat and a microphone, I won't stop. And I know we're running short of time, so I'm just going to share a few thoughts, if I may. And it's that peace, justice and human rights, when you told me about this and you said you wanted me to say a few words, I thought I could do a clever speech, and then I thought, no, I'm just going to share what it really means to somebody who grew up without any of those things. So I was in Northern Ireland during a very vicious conflict. We didn't have peace or justice because we had no human rights. And I recall not being able to go to school without fear, not being able to go shopping without certainly having my bag searched, and my mum always being with me. Never sat at a cafe, sat on a pavement enjoying a cup of coffee. And that was until the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and it was intended to be a peace agreement. It wasn't just a non-violence agreement. And it was based on human rights, but not some notional concept of human rights. It was human rights that were universal, that applied to everybody equally, but most importantly, I think, and it's so interesting to hear from the judge, that could be enforced directly and very quickly in a local court, and that's what was key to it. So that's what the Universal Declaration was all about, recognising peace, justice, human rights were interdependent. But in Northern Ireland, it went even further than that. So it's the Northern Ireland Act, following the Human Rights Act, which incorporated the Convention. And I would just say, without it, I think we're in a lot of trouble. But with the Human Rights Act and then the Northern Ireland Act, which went a step further and said that our local devolved administration couldn't enforce laws if they were incompatible with human rights. And that was fairly breathtaking. It hasn't been enforced in practice. I would say the theory is terrific, the practice maybe not as good. But in Northern Ireland, we were in the midst of bombs, shootings, internment, allegations of torture, including by the state, murder. The state that was there to protect us were often seen as the aggressor and those that we should be frightened of. Human rights, the notion of human rights, other than non-violence, was fanciful. We didn't enjoy any human rights. So that was what was so key to start enjoying human rights, to get peace. But we weren't going to be allowed to enjoy our human rights unless there was first peace. So it became this awful, vicious circle. But human rights were to be at the heart of government. Everything they did, it was supposed to inform government law policy, but also constrain it. And if government is not constrained according to an enforceable human rights framework, that's when I think things go wrong. You can't pick and choose. You have to be signed up to the framework, or they're of no real effect. In drafting the declaration, I think what they had in mind, which is what we learnt only too well and still recently, is that the framework of principles, and just hearing about individual rights, etc., the framework of principles have to derive from what it is to be human. Then you can go on and look at collective rights. You can look at whether individuals need something more to be able to enjoy their rights. But it's the notion of being human. And if one human is denigrated, so are we all, and then society follows very quickly afterwards. We also know in Northern Ireland there's no limit to what a man or woman is capable of doing. And we know there's no limit globally to what a man or woman can do if there is no framework. And if human rights of one, even a tiny minority group, are denigrated, then society suffers in the long term. And it's not even the long term, I would say very quickly. The notion that human rights are anti-democratic, because I would say it's a given that peace, justice, human rights and democracy all go hand in hand. But there is a rhetoric at the moment that human rights are anti-democratic because, for example, they may stop the Illegal Migration Act, which is currently having its own little bit of history in the UK. Now, the Human Rights Commission is challenging that act on the basis that it is incompatible with human rights of asylum seekers and refugees. And I was asked just this morning, what has that got to do with you or with Northern Ireland? There's so few asylum seekers and refugees touched by the Act. Well, what I said was that in Northern Ireland, we know that the minute you single out a minority and you don't give them protection, then everybody suffers. So it is absolutely about us. Asylum seekers and refugees are our neighbours and our friends, and we will seek to persuade them. But I've been accused of being anti-democratic and dangerous even. Democracy values everyone equally, which this Act does not do. So we are here and we're doing the job which we were set up to do, which is to challenge government when it oversteps the mark. So I would simply say that democracy the human rights are the epitome of democracy when properly understood. And Baroness Hale, the woman with the spider brooch in the Supreme Court, much more dangerous because much more powerful than me. But she also said democracy values everyone equally, even if the majority does not. And that's why human rights are so critical. As Ruairí said very cleverly, if I may say, policing was the success story of Northern Ireland. And I saw that up close. And why was it a success story? Because they set aside what they knew. They learnt that when they tried to bend the rules to try and keep us safe, their logic, many of them doing what they thought was the right thing to keep us safe. Then community turned against them. They lost the one real tool they had, which was community intelligence and cooperation. They couldn't fight their way out of it. And they realised that the adoption of a human rights approach would be effective, and it is effective. And successive chief constables have said that, not just because it sounds nice, but because it's effective in practice. And Hugh Ord, in fact, one of our first reforming chief constables, went back to GB and suggested that they really could look at a human rights approach to security, because particularly when the state is under threat, that's when human rights will protect individuals, but also the state. And he gave an example, and I was there to watch it, of a parade. Ruairí also mentions the right to parade and how human rights help us balance these sorts of issues. One parade in which live ammunition was fired, many police officers were injured. It brought Belfast to a standstill. The next year, that same parade went up the same road simply because a different approach was taken. There were 2 police officers in shirt sleeves, and the parade went without any violence at all. And that's because they adopted a human rights approach. They spoke to local communities, they spoke to perpetrators, they spoke to business people, etc. And they went out in an unmilitaristic way. And there has never been a contentious parade up that road, even though it continues to go up that road ever since. So I would like to just mention, if I may, Ukraine. I think the ambassador's here, and certainly we're honoured to have the judge. Hello. I had the great pleasure and privilege of visiting Ukraine in June, so I travelled around the country, and I was there. I was hosted by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Human Rights, Dmytro Lubinets. And it really struck me that in the midst of that awful situation, their aspiration to solidify rights protection and to look for more protection, including to prisoners of war, was so inspirational. And it did remind me of Northern Ireland a little bit. So noises during the night, wondering somebody being hurt or killed, when it was all going to end, how you possibly plan for the future. But in the midst of that, he did not say it would be so much easier to deal with this conflict if I could just bend the rules a little bit for a period of time, just a little bit, and just where it suits, take back control, take the gloves off. Not once did I hear that. And I was there for a considerable period of time. They embraced and cherished human rights and asked for our help in building them even further. So I came away with a newfound understanding of what human rights really means and how they will help in situations like Ukraine and help to Northern Ireland. But we are at risk of just frittering away the progress we've made and letting it wither in the vine. And I really do worry about that. So yes, human rights, democracy are under threat, not by negligence, but by design, and that terrifies me. So I'll sit down again.
Thank you very much, Alyson. That was excellent. Can I just ask you one question? And it's a question that's been bothering me a lot. It's about identity politics. Human rights for all of us is a Parnassus. It's the great aspiration. But now we're faced with many people having given away their privacy, which is no longer considered to be important. It's been traded away. They now place an importance on identity politics, which is often a group politics. Does that threaten the importance of human rights in the way it has taken up so much airtime in our contemporary discourse?
It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to if we don't let it. So an awful lot of this is the so-called culture war, the anti-woke movement. Identity is just about enabling a person to enjoy their own human dignity. And if you go back to, sometimes when I struggle with some of these issues myself, and we're faced at the moment with quite a few identity issues in Northern Ireland, for which there isn't an obvious answer. But I keep going back to the Convention and the Human Rights Act, and it actually sets out a lovely little sort of decision-making model as to how you might be able to work through it. And there is give and take, but it has to be more disciplined than just, today I'll take one and tomorrow you can have one. But identity is too often used to hurt individuals and certainly to hurt groups of people. But we have to, if we believe in human rights at all, we believe in the individual. And so long as you don't claim a right to identify as something which is harmful to others. But we're in a very, I don't even want to get into the identity issue, which is vexing people at the moment, because I think that is something that's being used to push us apart rather than to bring us together.
Thank you very much. Can I now go to Salome Mbugua, who is a human rights activist and very knowledgeable about the whole issue of migration and women, peace and security, both in Africa and in Ireland. Would you like the microphone? Or do you want that?
Yes, well stand, rather than sitting down. So thank you so much, and thank you for the organizers of this meeting this morning. It's very, very timely, and as we celebrate the 75th anniversary, I feel very honored to speak to you. Actually, it was our ambassador who forwarded this invitation to me to speak here. Michael Mufea from the Kenyan embassy, who have actually now relocated back to Kenya, and I see some of the people from the embassy here. By the time the Human Rights Declaration was adopted in 1948, many African countries, if not all, they were under colonial rule. And so when we actually came, all of us, these 54 African countries to become independent, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was very, very handy and timely for countries that were actually emerging from colonial rules and them adopting into what actually should be. And so I must say that, most of the African countries then have emerged into adapting the Human Rights Declaration and improving and progressing significantly. For example, my country, Kenya, has made significant progress in various areas, such as economic growth, such as in infrastructures. If you go to Nairobi and Kenya, you will see it, healthcare and all that. So they are improving, but these countries, the African countries, are in progress, as we can say. And it's very, very good actually to see that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights keep on being referenced, when anything go wrong. Because sometimes, we have a lot of conflict, in African countries as well, as we are having now in some part of Europe as well and in the world. And so, despite that, we have these universal declarations of human rights, and it continues to be inspirational. There's still lack of awareness. This is my observation actually from my work. I've worked quite a lot in Europe and in Africa, but you find that still people don't know, or they're not aware of universal declarations of human rights. I try to talk to the women and teach them about the 30 articles. I also sit here in Ireland as a human rights commissioner. Actually, I'm one of the 15 commissioners that are appointed by the President of Ireland. And when I go to talk about human rights to women that I work with, most of them are unfamiliar with the articles. None of them that knows that even their right to seek asylum, Article 13 is there, or Article 14 on freedom of movement. So it's very, very important, that when we talk about universal declarations of human rights, that we don't assume that it's everybody who understands them or who knows them. There's still that quite of a lack of awareness, in so many that so many people don't have. But when we talk about these universal declarations of human rights, sometimes you wonder why we still have a lot of issues still going on. And when they are not upheld, the 30 articles, when they are not upheld, then what do we get? We get inequality. And we see it, and especially when we talk about it now, this actually month, in the last 16 days that are going to finish on the 10th of this month, because it's the 16 days of activism on violence against women, that still, we see the inequality and how, for example, women continue to suffer in issues of violence against women. I was actually going through statistics on what is happening in the world situation of violence against women. And I was shocked to see that quite often we don't actually calculate the cost of inequality, for example. And violence against women, for example, in 2021, highlighted that this is actually by the Arat report in 2023, 45,000 women in 2021, they were killed or murdered by their partners or family members or people who knew them very well. Why is this happening? Yet we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It means that the human rights are not upheld. And when they are not upheld, then we have issues, we have problems. I was introduced as somebody who believes so much in women, peace and security. And I have actually done a lot of studies on women, peace and security. I was involved in the developing of the 3rd National Action Plan for Ireland on women, peace and security. And it was also still horrifying to see in Northern Ireland we don't have a plan, to be able to talk about what happened, like Ruli said at the beginning. When conflict happened, when violence happened, do we go back and try to recalculate on what has happened, what impact it has left on people? And so the National Women, Peace and Security agenda that sometimes, when we talk about it as people who are from the Western world, assume that we all understand. It's very, very different understood by the women, for example, in Democratic Republic of Congo, because of what is happening on the ground. The political situations, the economical situations, but also the social situations on the ground. And so working with women here in Ireland, I always see that, when women have come maybe from Ukraine, they have come from Syria, they have come from Afghanistan, because we are working with many of them. How are we facilitating them to be able to cope with what have happened, to be able actually actually to function. What are we doing about the relief and recovery of the people who have come into the Western world? Leave alone the Africans, because there are still people in Africa who are in refugee camps. But what are we doing with women who have come from these countries who need this? We've seen a lot of exploitation, for example. In July, there was an article in the newspaper here in Ireland that mentioned that, Radrod are seeking sex for Lent. These are people who are vulnerable. These are people who are supposed to be protected. So when we talk about the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, which is very important, we are celebrating it at the 75th anniversary, we must ask ourselves, what about those who are left behind? Because apart from the declaration itself, there are so many other conventions and treaties that support this convention, including the Sustainable Development Goals of leaving no one behind. But still, we will find that a majority of the people are still left behind. We also see it, for example, in Ireland with the far right of what happened a week ago. And it was very horrifying. Sometimes it's very, very difficult and scaring. Myself as a black woman walking in the street of Dublin, because you don't know what you'll meet on your way. So when we ask whether human rights are in danger, of course we see them, they're in danger. But the declarations have advanced a lot of issues that could not have been advanced without this declaration. So we might actually look at it that way. So I want to finish by saying that upholding the principles outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights remain very essential. They emphasize on the importance of protecting individual rights. So when we talk about Universal Declarations of Human Rights, we cannot talk about them as, they are just to cover a group. We also have to think of them, at an individual capacity and how they impact on individuals as well. It's very important to emphasize on the importance of protecting the individual rights and freedom as the foundation for peace, secure and peaceful world. That peace is very core. It's very, very important. And it can only happen when we actually put it at that individual level and then collectively. But also, I want to go back, as an African woman, because I cannot actually separate myself with my continent of Africa, that we have to ensure that although we are living in a global world, that's what I want to mean, that we also have to live about the others that are being left behind when we talk about these Universal Declarations of Human Rights. So even in terms of women, peace, and security and supporting women who are still living in conflict, we have to bring the language that we use, in our policies, in our treaties, and in our convention to the understanding of those people who are on the ground. So making sure that we are not leaving anybody behind, and that even the dangers that are posed by what is happening now will not end up impacting on very, very vulnerable people in a very, very serious way. Thank you.
Salome, can I just ask now a question about the Irish state and its treatment of migrant workers? Obviously, in terms of asylum seekers and migrants, there is a European Receptions Directive. How does the Irish government measure up in terms of protecting? I'm not talking about society as a whole, but just how does our administration measure up in defending the rights of asylum seekers and migrants?
I'll actually start by saying it's very unfortunate because of what is happening now. We know it was announced, I think you can hear me with this one, yeah? I think it was announced, I think it's 2 days ago, that people seeking international protection will no longer have accommodation, which is very unfortunate. So they will be provided with a sleeping bag and a voucher. These actually go beyond the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. People have the right to seek asylum. People have the right to be protected. And so it's important for that to happen. But just saying that, the Irish government is trying as well. There are a lot of issues and problems with housing, for example. So when you talk about accommodation, you have to be very realistic and sincere of what we are talking about. So there's that issue of housing that don't only affect migrants and people coming into the country, it's actually affecting the whole population. There are good things happening, with the government treatment of people coming to seek international protection, because I work, mainly in this area. So there are policy there, and they're also working with groups and organizations, but we could still do better. In particular, in protection of women, especially vulnerable women, who are put into emergency accommodations, because we have around almost 100 emergency accommodation centers. So it's very, very difficult to to be able to make sure that these women are safe and secure, or these people are protected fully. But I would say we are not the worst when we come to, in Ireland, we are not the worst when we come to protecting the rights of people seeking international protection. We are trying, but we can do much better, and especially looking into this issue of not having people get into accommodation, because empty. I see a lot of places and way that we can organize ourselves to put these people into accommodation as well. But they have food. Most of them who are in accommodation, they have food. Issues of privacy, issues that we are trying to talk, with the government and some of the departments that work on this area, on how the privacy and dignity of people seeking international protection can be improved. So these discussions are happening and things are happening. I wouldn't say Ireland is the worst when we come to looking into the issues of people seeking international protection. But they need to do something about the far right, because there's misinformation that is being spread. There's a lot of, long, information being given and circulated to what we are calling the far right, and then impacting on very, very vulnerable people. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all our panelists. This was, I think, an excellent panel with 4 very eminently qualified people. I think it has shown that human rights is very much a work in progress. The ambassador talked about human rights be a beacon of hope. The problem with beacons is they can be easily extinguished. So let's carry that flame. Thank you very much. There will be a short break, but we will start the next session at 11:40 promptly.
So we have like 2 questions, if anybody wants to ask them. No questions?
Thank you very much. My name is Mike. I'm the ambassador of the Netherlands in Ireland. I recently arrived. I hugely appreciate having this important seminar. Human rights is at the core of our foreign policy and at home, because it's work in maintenance, as was said. My question is about the lack of awareness of human rights. And as embassies, we do a lot of advocacy abroad, but I always notice that at home we take them for granted. People are not fully aware of what they have, and they do not cherish it sufficiently, which is room for populism and the sentiments that have come up. So I sometimes wonder, how can we make it more tangible for everybody? What's in it for them? What are human rights? But there is the statement, the declarations, the organizations, but we should maybe try to make it even more tangible also to people who have them, who enjoy them, but who don't cherish them. So your suggestions.
Maybe I could pass that to Alyson.
Yes, there are 2 things we have to do. We have to stop the misinformation, disinformation, and just untruths that are said about human rights, about what they lead to and what human rights actually are. I every single day I have to correct something that somebody asks me about. Why does this mean? And I say, well, it doesn't. And it can range from it's nonsense about human rights, meaning that convicted rapists are entitled to access pornography in prison, to ridiculous things that get a hold on people. And then they think it's dangerous, that it's going to undermine. And at the same time as doing that, we need to tell people what it is that they're enjoying every day and why that's founded in human rights. And it's not just this airy concept of what other people get. And I was looking at the human rights report that they do around the world for the UK government publishes. And there are lots of countries around the world that it analyses in terms of its human rights record, but doesn't mention what it's doing at home in relation to protection of human rights at a time when people like myself are challenging the home record on human rights. And I think people at home need to be not looking outside all the time, but also looking at home. What do we need to do here? And what is it that's going to change for me? And I think people need to understand what will change if they don't have human rights, and what it is. Us just sitting here having this conversation, me being free to say what I'm saying and still being funded by the Westminster government, that's founded in human rights as well. What used to be called civil liberty. So I think it's just correcting that narrative and stopping all the nonsense that's talked about human rights. Did you want to?
Anyone else? No. All right.
Okay.
All are settled, are they? Very good. Let us proceed then after a very riveting first session. And I hope that this one will be equally thought-provoking and hopefully promote more conversation on the issues. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Ambassador de la Riva for inviting me to chair this session. And also, I'd like to thank Ambassador Maruyama for his very kind words about me at his address. And in that context, ladies and gentlemen, and in light of what was mentioned in the previous panel's discussions, I'd like to draw your attention to 104 years ago. In the previous discussion, Dr. Gnatovsky spoke about the pre-existing ideas for the Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago. And in that context, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to draw your attention to a little historical detail. It was Japan who proposed the initial Declaration of Universality of Human Rights, and particularly a racial equality clause at the Congress of Versailles, or the Peace Conference of Versailles in 1919. So I think it's very interesting to think that at the opening of the 20th century, that proposal came from East Asia, from Japan, to Europe in the West. It was seconded by the Netherlands and by France. Unfortunately, it was opposed by Britain and the United States. And I think, again, echoing what Pat Cox had said in his wonderful address to us at the beginning, America has to listen to Europe. It has to listen more to its allies and its friends. And that is a very important point. So this panel is going to look at aspects of the impact of disinformation and misinformation on democratic processes and human rights. And we are joined here today by Adrian Weckler, who is the technology expert and editor in the Irish and Sunday Independent newspapers, Dr. Paul Gillespie, who is a columnist with and former foreign policy editor of the Irish Times, and he also directs the program for the Constitutional Futures After Brexit at University College Dublin's School of Politics and International Relations. And we are also joined, and very privileged to be so, by Rushan Abbas, who many of you may know is foremost in the world in representing the rights of the Uyghur people, which have been so savagely trampled upon by a certain regime in China. And she is the founder and executive director of the Campaign for the Uyghurs. So I just want to open my remarks. This is going to be a conversational style discussion. And just to point out that in the attempts to preserve and to maintain the human rights and civil rights, it is vitally important that we have access to justice, access to constitutionality, accountability, the rule of law, and protection from arbitrary government or tyranny. And in this regard, it is vitally important that we have a free press. This is so fundamental in holding the authorities to account, speaking truth to power. And yet such an idea, in reality, even in the robust liberal democracies, vigilance in maintaining objective, informed, responsible, and conscientious journalistic and editorial standards in the face of corporate, political, ideological, and populist pressure has been absolutely necessary. And with the global expansion of online social media, increasing numbers of people, particularly in the younger generation, the so-called Generation X, receive information in sound bites bereft of serious analysis or context from online news sources for free. This is compounded by malevolent actors under various guises in the blogosphere, the so-called cyberspace warriors, who spread fake news and conspiracy theories at the behest of political or ideological entities, some of whom are national governments. Recently, some countries around the world, including EU member states, in conjunction with the EU Commission, have given consideration and are introducing legislation to try to regulate for the problems that have arisen. But already concerns are being expressed that legislation that encourages censorship on social media might create more problems than it would resolve. For example, to what extent should the news that is read online in the EU or Ibero-America or in Africa or the Middle East or in Asia be decided by algorithms that are coded in California or Shenzhen? Should such online media companies be obliged to disclose which articles are being targeted by their censorship bots? These are the automated software applications. So my first question, it's an open question to the panel here, is this. From your experience and observation, how should such online media companies be obliged to disclose which articles are being targeted by their censorship bots? Do you think an international body should enforce compliance, or would national authorities or a supranational authority such as the EU be more effective? So, Adrian, would you like to kick off on this? You're the expert in these matters.
I would just like to point of order, though, on the Generation X remark. Speaking as somebody who is Gen X, I think you might have been talking about Gen Z. So we have Gen X, which is kind of my generation, which is early 90s. Then we have millennials. And then we have Gen Z. Now, I don't see many. I think there's one or two Gen Z back here. I see a fair amount of Gen X in the audience, and I actually see one or two boomers. So just so we're all clear on that when we start. But to your point, so should there be a supranational body, for example, the EU, that takes an interest in regulating and controlling and putting manners on algorithms that big tech use? Yes is the answer. We have the bones of that at the moment under the Digital Services Act, the EU. We actually have something called the European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency, which is based in Seville, which is starting to get up and running now. But ultimately, most of these big tech companies, and I talk to them quite a lot, they have a mixture of algorithmic moderation, regulation, and humans. Now, it gets very tricky when you get to the human bit, because what crosses the line? So, for example, 2 weeks ago we had riots in Dublin, and there was a well-known mixed martial arts fighter whose name rhymes with Monor McGregor, right? And he was on the social media platform called X, which is formerly called Twitter, saying that Ireland is at war, and issuing kind of words and statements to that effect. Elon Musk, the owner of X, said that Ireland was part of that the Irish government, the Irish Taoiseach, who is partially Indian, ethnically, hates the Irish people. And he said that the Irish government hates the Irish people. And the show that he promoted, which is hosted by former Fox News presenter Tucker Carlson, started out by saying that the Irish government is clearly trying to replace native Irish people with people from the third world. Now, how close does that get to the line of what misinformation or disinformation, because there's a difference between the two. Misinformation is something that's just incorrect. Disinformation is something that you know or that you calculate is wrong, but you calculate is going to have an effect. It's unclear whether Tucker Carlson actually believes that or whether he's just doing it cynically. But how close to the line does that get? And in adjudicating how close to the line does that get, how much should YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, X itself, we know what X's opinion seems to be, which is just to let it flow. Musk says he's a free speech absolutist. So how close to the line does that get for the humans who are in charge in Meta? Now, there was an Oireachtas hearing. The Oireachtas is, as you all know, is the Irish Parliament. They had a joint hearing yesterday with TDs and senators where they brought in 3 of the 4 big tech companies. They brought in Meta, Google, and TikTok. X wasn't there, of course, because why should X? X just sticks 2 fingers up to most governments when it comes to issues like this. And they admitted that they do have committees and they have humans who make these decisions. I was disappointed that committee didn't interrogate more, look for names, look for more transparency on the criteria with which those decisions are made. I'm hoping that the new European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency in Seville will do that. But I'll tell you what we do need. We do need more than just the odd tweet or a letter from Commissioner Thierry Breton. Thierry has gone up against Musk once or twice on Twitter. He's also written letters. He's spoken about this. I haven't seen all that much action yet on misinformation or disinformation or algorithms. The EU being the EU, it does take a while to get up and running. And when it gets up and running, as we've seen from privacy fines, it does actually pack a punch. But I would like to see that. I'd like to see the meat on the bones of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Rushan, have you any particular views on this matter, particularly in relation to your own experience as an activist and coming under both scrutiny and intimidation from Chinese Communist Party? Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you so much. Before I answer the question, I just want to quickly, for a couple minutes, I'm going to sum up today's situation of the Uyghur people in connection with my personal experience. And thank you, everyone, for giving me this opportunity to speak. The Communist Party has been oppressing the Uyghur people for decades. And however, the persecution has developed into a full-fledged active genocide since 2017, targeting us because of our ethnicity, our background, culture, religion, and our natural resources. The CCP's documented crimes are too numerous to list, but I'm just going to quickly mention a few here. Illegal mass detention, indoctrination, torture, systematic mass rape, harsh prison sentences, Orwellian surveillances, child abduction, forced labor, organ harvesting, and a crematoria for a culture that doesn't practice cremation. Uyghur women's bodies are being the battleground of this genocide while they are facing forced sterilization, forced abortions, and forcibly marrying Han Chinese men. With that, the Uyghur birth growth dropped to 0% in some of the mostly Uyghurs populated counties. I became a full-time activist out of necessity. Just a little over 5 years ago, I was doing my full-time job as an international business development director in Washington, D.C. In 2017, 24 people from my husband's family went missing. And when I spoke about this in September 2018, my own sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, a retired medical doctor, was abducted only 6 days after that first public speech that I participated in a panel like this. Basically, my freedom of speech in the United States as an American citizen cost my sister's freedom. Since I have been in Dublin last few days, we are experiencing Beijing's information war in real time here. I had a panel discussion at the University College Dublin that the Chinese Student Association, in influence with the Confucius Institute, had been demanding to be canceled, repeatedly contacting the organizers. During my interview 2 days ago on the radio, the Chinese embassy in Dublin issued a false statement, falsely claiming the Uyghurs are living happy and free lives. While my fellow Uyghur person here who lives in Dublin, Irish citizen, Norio, she cannot communicate with her family for past 6-7 years due to some of the safety concerns for their family members back home. My other Uyghur people living in Dublin, there are about 200 population. They are afraid of meeting me while I'm here. The Chinese authorities has developed the most sophisticated and technologically advanced model for this modern genocide, which also includes their global systematic disinformation campaign that keep the world in dark to evade responsibility. They invest billions to acquire stakes in foreign media companies, sponsor online influencers, secure content sharing agreements, and even impact academic institutions globally. If I left unaddressed, the CCP's disinformation about Uyghur atrocities will alter the worldwide information environment. They already have. Their distortions and omissions of the truth will influence democracies to prioritize China's interests over your own economy, moral, and the security concerns. I will conclude by reading a quote from the international human rights lawyer David Mathis, in quote, "Unless today's victims are defended, we run the risk of becoming tomorrow's victims," unquote. So we must take swift action while we still can to ensure that they safeguard the freedom of conscience without oppression and preserve the fundamental principles of democracy, human dignity, and the freedoms for generations to come. To speaking about how important it is to have the free media, the EU, and the other platforms when we face a government like Chinese regime completely controls the news and everything that people hear. It is extremely important for us to have free platforms and the media and the governments. We have been hearing lip service for years. We have been crying out loud for years. But it's time to see some actual tangible actions. Thank you.
Thank you. In light of your experience and what you've shared with us, Rushan, do you think that we could do more here in the West to counter the online abuse coming from actors in China, etc.? I mean, we've often seen and laughed at attempts by Chinese activists, or I should say Chinese communist activists, to declare that nothing happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. This is all a figment of imagination, and it's erased completely. And this damnatio memoriae, or damnation of memory, that they engage in has been quite effective within their own society, but it does affect some people here in the West as well who might not be entirely well read in matters of political history, etc. So do you see any means by which, here in the West, those you engage with, for instance, in the United States, about protection of Uyghur rights, is there any way you can see, or would you like to propose protections online?
Speaking what Adrian just mentioned, the points of social media, Facebook, Twitter, X, YouTube, and Instagram, those are not open for the general public in China. The Chinese government completely restricted. Not just that they have access and using those social media platforms, but if any of the ordinary Chinese people use the VPN to have access to social media, as soon as they turn the VPN on, police shows up at the door in 5 minutes later. While the general Chinese public cannot use any of those free social platforms, the Chinese actors, the people that they are using in different parts of the world are on the social media constantly attacking us, harassing us, spreading libel and the defamation, and try to discredit our work while spreading heavy disinformation. All of a sudden, we have Uyghur people from our province, Xinjiang, we call East Turkestan, putting the happy videos on YouTube, on Twitter, saying that, I have a wonderful job and I'm living happy life. How did she or he have access to that? And also, the freedom of speech, freedom of expression that we have in the West is actually being used against us, manipulated and misused to completely try to rewrite our history. For example, myself, I'm not only being targeted by the state media, the Chinese China Global Times Network or CCTV or Xinhua News constantly attacking me. Even when I had my sister, when she was detained, when I was so vocal about it, I didn't stay silent as they expected me to. When I wrote op-eds published in the Washington Post and giving interviews on all the major media, the China Global Times Network published an article saying that I was stealing other people's photo and claiming this is my missing relative and spreading lies about China. What bothers me the most is today I am constantly being harassed, attacked online, not just me, my sister who's in jail, even my parents who already passed away, and they are even attacking them to completely perpetrate me as somebody who is a trash or, not have the credibility to speak for the Uyghurs' behalf. How come that we don't have any kind of legislation on those social media or countries to protect us? There should be differences between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the blatant harassment, defamation, and libel, and the blackmail, and the intimidation. And I'm even receiving death threats on social media. So how do we do that? Some of the legislation that we worked the last few years, like Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is became a law in the United States, and now it's implementing and stopping some of the companies to import the goods made by Uyghur forced laborers, my people's blood, sweat, and tears, which China is using this genocide, a profitable venture, by using the Uyghurs as slaves. If we can have a similar legislation in the EU or in the member states like Ireland to stop those, every country should have some sort of import ban, and the slavery, the goods manufactured by forced labor, should be against any country's constitution. And again, how do we protect these Uyghur, the people who's living in Ireland? There is a Chinese police station here in Dublin today. So I'm not talking about within China's borders, thousands of miles away. I'm talking about here in Dublin, in Ireland.
I think that Chinese police station was closed down by the Irish authorities immediately when it was discovered last year. But yes, it is a matter of concern. We are well aware of that. Thank you. Paul, may I draw you in on this discussion with regards to how you would see means to regulate this sort of online misinformation, disinformation, attacks, etc.?
I had dinner last night with a group of former colleagues from the Irish Times, and I put it to a former editor of the paper who works in some of these areas, whether he considers these companies to be publishers. And he said yes, and so did most people around that table. And I certainly do as a journalist. If you go back to the origin of printing in the late 15th century, it took battles over the next 150 200 years to establish the rights to publish and the rights of media that surround publication. And those were really very frenetic political battles and involved a lot of human rights transgressions. But gradually there was the build-up of such rights, and to do with defamation, to do with libel, to do with threats of the kind we've just heard about. And so far as I'm concerned, as a generalization, these companies are publishers, and they ought to be regulated in line with that perception. Now, it's very interesting to hear about the new EU algorithm. I wasn't aware of this. And certainly it seems that these algorithms are capable of being, the companies put such effort into it, they certainly should be regulated, so far as I'm concerned. I think the regulation can happen at national, supranational and universal level. And there needs to be a coordination about this. In preparing for today, I was interested to read about a seminar held in Beijing on the question of, on the Universal Declaration and the kind of approaches being taken by official theorists to that subject. And they stress inclusiveness, exchange of information, and mutual learning as norms that ought to apply in this area. And just as Pat Cox developed a critique of Western approaches to human rights and the threat from within, I think we should take, in light of what we've heard about China here, we should take such statements which come from serious people in China seriously and develop the kind of critique that arises from that of Chinese practice, because you have this great disjunction in the area of human rights between the theorizing and the practice. We heard it, it's so blatant. That links also to the unawareness that we heard about in the previous session, which is a major factor. People are simply not aware that there are such rights at universal or national or regional levels, and that's something that media, of course, can play a big role in. When we talk about universality of rights, we have to contextualize that. It must come back to the experience of people in particular nation states, in particular localities or regions, because that's where you learn your universality. And I think the same will apply to the regulation of these companies. It is obscene that some of the richest companies in the world remain unregulated in this way. And again, I take Pat Cox's point about it's market driven, and the assumption is that that is for the best. And we saw in the remarkable turnaround of the AI company, a couple of weeks ago, those forces at play. So we're actually perhaps even. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of this subject in terms of regulation.
Can I attempt to make a qualified defense of the tech companies, even though it's not my place to do so, but I'm conscious that we probably all have a similar mind here. What the tech companies constantly say is, tell us what to do. Give us in black and white the rules. Tell us which statements go over the line and which don't. And to be honest, we're not great at doing that. Okay, like at the moment we have an online hate bill in Ireland. It's going through. It's quite a controversial piece of legislation because, among other things, it criminalises, makes it an offence to have material in your possession, say on this iPad or say on your phone, which you have not yet shared or disseminated in any way, but might be regarded as hateful, and that is an offence. Okay, now it's with a view to sharing it. Okay, there's huge confrontation and conflict over this. Over what constitutes hateful material, for example. So it's just a brief comment to say that, to be fair to the tech companies, yes, they're utterly motivated by profit. And there is an inevitability about what they're doing because the internet is the internet and there's no going back from the internet, folks. As much as Media House and the Irish Independent and, the Irish Times might like, a new golden age, it's not going to happen, okay? So the internet is here. But the tech companies would say, look, just please tell us what to do. Give us the guidelines.
So the message going from this panel essentially is to governments, you need to get your act together and talk to the media companies, give them a set of clear guidelines. This is what we want you to do, etc.
Social media companies,
social media, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And as a bulwark, I'd also say, and this is a divisive opinion in the company I work in, fund public media, okay? Because if you look at in the UK, in Ireland, you look at BBC, RT, look what happened in the US.
Yes.
When they stopped, effectively diluted the what was it called, the Fair Broadcasting Doctrine or whatever it was. Yeah, okay.
Federal Communications Commission.
Yeah, under Reagan. They absolutely whacked it down. Look what's happened since. And we can talk about Facebook, we can talk about Mark Zuckerberg. Rupert Murdoch. News Corporation, okay, Fox News, Tucker Carlson. A lot of the stuff that you see that's the worst offending stuff on social media comes from those sources, okay, or is egged on by those sources. So, but it hasn't happened to the same degree, even though the UK has a very robust, quite aggressive right-wing press and private press. The BBC is a really strong bulwark against that. And in Ireland, I would say RTE is quite a strong bulwark against that as well. So even if we're not 100% sure about the regulations and how to steer the algorithms, we can take a defensive measure and make sure that, you know, media that it doesn't have the pressure of just chasing clicks at any cost, that can act as an insurance, I think.
Yes, Paul.
No, I agree, and it's very valuable to extend this discussion from the misinformation, disinformation online and from the high-tech companies into the role of media as a whole, because the kind of oligopolistic practices and the internationalization of those overlaps very much, I think. We're talking about, if we're talking about media and if these companies are, as we understand it, in media and publishers, well, you've got a common problem there that needs to be looked at in that kind of collective way.
Would anyone from the audience like to come in on this discussion? It's, yes. We have roving mic there. Yes. There's someone up here who wants to.
Thank you. I thought it was about second or third in line, so I've kind of like completely forgotten what I was going to ask. My name is Fiona Crowley, and I'm with Amnesty International Ireland. Obviously, the role of social media has kind of really, I suppose, caused Amnesty to try and kind of like change its game, and we have, you know, set up kind of like a reasonably new tech company, sort of disproportionately staffed by Irish people, which is just weird, but good. But so we are very interested to know what it is that our role could be, because we don't want to duplicate the efforts of others, but also like in terms of our our main target is generally governments, and what it is that we can ask governments to do rather than just create new rules and so on, but also is there anything practical that can be done? For instance, fact-checking is so important, and that is generally left in Ireland to kind of, you know, relatively sort of like underfunded, you know, again, private media. And is there a roles that states can do? But then again, I suppose, I mean, how do we ensure that we're fact-checking the fact-checkers? So just, I suppose, in terms of, you know, the human rights organisations that are really trying to struggle with the new challenges that this tech and tech to come, and all sorts of other kind of sort of, I suppose, new innovations that could be potentially dangerous and harmful to people coming down the line. What is it that we can usefully do in this context? Thank you.
I'll take it if you... Does anyone? Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Thank you so much. And Amnesty International has been a very pioneer on the highlighting some of the atrocities, especially for the Uyghurs. Amnesty International did their first report in 1999, actually, before any international entities put together any reports. So it's extremely important for entities like Amnesty International to continuously produce reports with, as you said, you know, fact-checking, but with specific recommendations for the governments, for the lawmakers and the countries to move forward with actual tangible actions to defend and protect the information and to fight back against the authoritarian regime's disinformation and the massive control and the manipulation of the media. When some countries like United States or UK or activists like myself, when we speak out, the Chinese government tried to quickly dismiss by saying this is the West's plot against the US or against China, or call us, label us as separatists. But if international entities like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the other human rights defenders, if they bring their voice, if they produce reports and send recommendations, and privately and publicly, it goes far away. Thank you.
Thank you. Adrian, you're going to come in.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, fact-checking. I mean, it's quite ironic that Google is actually one of the main entities that funds fact-checking. It does so through associations with the Journal and with others. But here we go again, because who has the money to do that? Well, it's Google. In terms of what the state can do, other than being part of a supranational body like the European Union, which is introducing these rules, which we've talked about before, it's difficult, really, beyond that, beyond individual initiatives. For an organisation like Amnesty, I would suggest that right now what we are is in a battle and a war for influence. So I have a 21-year-old stepdaughter. See, she is proper Gen Z, by the way. And her counterparts, they're bright and they're interested and they're not thick and they're not necessarily going to be duped all that easily. They are looking for points of view when they use the likes of TikTok, for example, in particular, or maybe Instagram to a lesser extent. They're looking for points of view. They're looking for persuasive and interesting and eye-opening facts. Now, if I'm in Amnesty or in an organisation like that, Amnesty does a very good job at bringing issues, surfacing issues, and bringing those to attention. Do more of that. So, for example, at the hearing of TDs and senators yesterday, there were maybe 8 or 9 TDs and senators. Only one of them used TikTok. Only one of them. They had the head of one of the public policy people from TikTok in. They didn't know what to ask her because they don't use it and they don't understand it. Now, TikTok is by far the most influential and the fastest growing social network. How many people in this room use TikTok?
Well,
wow.
It is a Chinese organised thing.
It's a Chinese owned. It's Chinese owned. ByteDance, yeah, absolutely.
And if it's Chinese owned, surely it's coming under the scrutiny of the Communist Party.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah, that debate is absolutely out there, and I'm sure you would have a strong view on that. All I'm saying is, folks, your kids are using TikTok. An awful lot of the battle for ideas is happening there. There's a reason why they were called in to that parliamentary session. If you want to win hearts and minds, as imperfect as it is, and there's a separate conversation as to whether TikTok should be more thoroughly interrogated or even whether it should be banned. I've heard that view, and there are good arguments around that as well. But that's where it's at. And if you want to influence, to win friends and influence people, while it is available and while it is used, that's where young people are.
Would I be going so far as to suggest that what we're looking at is a new front then, when we think in military terms or economic terms? We have, you talk about economic warfare or military warfare. Are we looking now at a new front opening up in the internet, cyberspace that
It's not even a new front. It's not even a new front. I mean, with Huawei, yep. It's been there for 10 years. I don't know.
Yeah. No, it is a new front. We should realise how new it is, and how little we know how to answer some of the questions that have come, up here. I would advocate you pitch the regulation at national terms, as we've heard, from the discussion yesterday, at European terms and at universal terms, and the rights that we affirm at universal level can feed back into that discussion. That's the only way to animate the document. I just repeat that one of the big problems is simply the unawareness of what's there already, and it needs to be reactivated in this. Yes. And you also need to reactivate the fundamental notions of what media are in this discussion, which is why I think the experience of established media as publishers have a really great relevance to this, but you have to operationalise that into the new media.
Sure. So would you see possibilities there for an information campaign being directed at younger generations as well as the older generations about the potentialities of this information age, the technologies, the media, and the need to counter obviously the cyber warriors operating on behalf of certain regimes are at an advantage. They seem to be at an advantage over the rest of us. I mean, you criticise me for not being aware of Generation Z. Well, I used to complain to my parents I was born 200 years too late. I prefer, so, being an historian of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries particularly, I find it a much more elegant age than the one that we're in at the moment. But there we are. So would you agree that we need to have a concentrated re-education of society about this?
Well, we do. Yes.
And that would have to come.
And it comes from different generations. I think there is a craving amongst younger generations too, because of the discussion that's now much more active about misinformation and disinformation. A craving for that kind of democratic regulation to be applied in this arena. And that's a real entry point, from older to younger generations on what lessons we have already learned historically.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, we have a few. Yes, we have quite a few. Good.
I should be very brief. You talked about military war fronts, whatever. We have the visible layer of traditional media. We've the visible, if disputed, layer of social media. But beneath all of that is another layer of dark media. There's an absolutely wonderful book published by an Austrian journalist, Julia Ebner. And I think it's called Going Dark, but I may have the wrong name. And it instances, among other things, two persons. One, Mr. Breivik, who murdered 93 people in Norway, and one Mr. Tarrant, who murdered over 50 Muslims in Christchurch in New Zealand. And they found kindred spirits, isolated as you might suppose them to be, in the dark web, in spaces that we don't see. And they both killed people, they said, in order to publish their manifesto about the Great Replacement Theory. So the observation I want to make, if we're having a discussion in Ireland about the far right, is we need to look in the invisible places on the web that are not even part of our conversation here, because that's where that community flourishes most of all.
Thank you.
Can I just say that is a huge problem for two reasons. First of all, because so on the night of the Dublin riots, for example, there was most of the organisation of that happened on two platforms, WhatsApp and Telegram. Okay, WhatsApp and Telegram are both encrypted, more or less end to end. Meta owns WhatsApp. Even if Meta wants to apply some sort of filter or some sort of warning, initial warning sign on content that might be difficult there, it can't. And that you're running up against a conflict there with the European right to privacy, which is held as a right in Europe much more dearly than it is, for example, in the US. And we know that because most of the regulation of that actually happens here in Dublin. In terms of the dark web itself, the far right actually aren't that difficult to infiltrate. In Ireland, they're not anyway. There's not actually that many of them. And they tend to sort of let anybody into their Telegram groups and their WhatsApp groups because they're delighted for the attention. Okay, it's only when we see a big event like happened on November the 23rd. By the way, I was caught up in the middle of those riots. I went down from the Irish Independence Office, which is 600 yards, 6 o'clock, to a seething crowd, which was far right, which was chanting at the police. It became something much bigger and much uglier. I took a lot of video footage that time. But the dark web is something that it's even though it's not hard to infiltrate the far right, it's very difficult to get around there, and it's very difficult to keep tabs on it. But your point is well taken.
Mm-hmm. We have other questions here. Yep. So, who doesn't mind?
Hi, Jane Souter from Dublin City University. I just a couple of things reacting to Adrian. So we actually run the European Digital Media Observatory in Dublin that's funded by the Commission, and that's where the journal's fact checker comes from. So it's the European Commission funds that pay for that fact checker. And also just looking at the platforms yesterday, I find it kind of a little bit problematic, the notion. So I tend more towards Paul's point of view, I suppose. that they're just asking what can be done. So it took years of negotiation. The platforms have more lobbyists in Brussels than the oil companies to get the code of practice on disinformation. We've actually done 4 reports on how the platforms comply with the code, and we've had the same issues over and over between 2019 and 23, and basically they're incomplete and they basically don't comply. We also know that the one thing that would make a difference is the recommender algorithms. So the algorithms that actually choose what to boost and what not to boost. So even if you move away from the idea of content regulation, nobody actually has a right to have their content boosted. That's, completely different to freedom of speech. But the platforms absolutely refuse to say what it is that they're recommending and why. And I think that would be one of the biggest differences if we could actually enforce that and put the onus on the platforms to demonstrate that their recommender algorithms aren't causing harm. Because at the moment they actually have proof. And we've seen the leaked emails and so on, that the platforms are aware of the harm they cause with their algorithms. Everything from teenage anorexia to pro-suicide groups, to the far right, to all sorts of issues. And I think especially looking to 2024 and the multitude of elections all over the world and in this country, that there needs to be real pressure put on those platforms to perhaps even turn off recommender algorithms and let people go and find the information they're looking for rather than be pushed further and further down rabbit holes by recommender algorithms, particularly during electoral periods. I wonder what you think.
Never going to happen. And I'll tell you why. TikTok is the best example of that. On TikTok, you can turn off the recommender algorithm for content. It's a choice. It's right there. Almost nobody does it. The reason they don't do it is because TikTok itself is the algorithm. That's the reason you use it. You want to be entertained. You're looking for TikTok and the algorithm.
But they can turn it off for political content, particularly in electoral periods. And, I think if Amnesty International or anybody else wants to worry about what's actually happening with the far right, what's happening with anti-migrant speech and things, a big thing is a campaign that the recommender algorithms should be turned off for all of that kind of speech.
For that kind of speech or everything?
For the political speech in electoral periods.
And where do you draw the line of political speech?
Well, everything that's covered by the political ads, they're able to do that. They're able to say which ads are political and which aren't.
The ads, the ads are reasonably well they're somewhat well regulated. So with Meta, for example, as you know, with Meta, they and YouTube, they now must say who paid for them. All of that information.
There's huge holes in our evaluations.
Yeah. I just think it's not going to happen. But I mean, it's not a bad idea, but it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. We have some other questions here.
Hi, I suppose my question comes from the perspective I am a slightly older Gen Z, and my professional background is social media, and I just kind of want to highlight that we are completely correct in saying that young people, particularly, I would even point fingers again, so Gen Alpha are quite vulnerable, like TikTok, to put it professionally, is an absolute nightmare. But there is an argument made, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting that young people, like Gen Z, like ourselves, grew up with social media, it developed as we did, and we are slightly more equipped to identify disinformation. I mean, like, you should see the scams on Instagram back in the day, and then we could fall through them. And there's a reason now today that tech scams talk about e-tolls and "Mum, I lost my phone," and not vouchers to Pennies and Claire's. Most individuals I see fall into disinformation online, they're not me and my friends, although that does happen. A lot of times they're my aunts, my uncles, my parents' friends, my friends' parents. And everyone thinks they're invulnerable, but nobody here is. Like, I'm myself on that. So while we talk about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, how do we actually include, I suppose, the pride of other older vulnerable generations within this dialogue? Because I know the ones even a few of my professors I've seen fallen for things that maybe someone who grew up more social media might immediately sees an edited photo. And there's a lot of pride, I think, going on here. How do we include them in a nice, accepting way, but also being like, you're not involved in propaganda?
Well, I'll just say I endorse 100% everything you've just said. Older people, comparatively, are idiots when it comes to social media. I mean, look, we slag off young people for the social media and privacy. They're the ones who use Snapchat, which had the, ephemeral disappearing messages. We're the ones who use Facebook and everything else and get scammed by the most rudimentary tricks all the time, and we get away with it as well, and we treat it like it's dark magic. So there is a huge problem there in terms of perception. I do think it's being corrected at the moment, but as to your point, constructively, what can we do about that? It's a really good question, and bringing it back to misinformation and disinformation, I would just go back to the central point about media. I think people, whether they're young or old, will gravitate towards media that they find compelling and interesting and makes a difference in their lives. And I do think that the best medium to long-term way of addressing that is to have a robust, healthy, vital media ecosystem that can take some of the mad stuff on the fringes, because the internet is here, folks. We're going to have that, and there are much wider social issues as well. As long as there are people who are angry, who feel that they are part or separate from society, they are going to gravitate towards that social media, and they're going to go and they're going to look for like-minded people. But I think the answer is in a stronger media.
Rushan, have you any comments to make on that?
We are sort of running out of time, so yes, I agree with everything Adrian said, but I just want to point another issue, actually. When we have so much disinformation, and when we have our own legislators from Ireland, from Dublin, here in our own town hall, repeating those disinformation, and then not willing to engage and listen to our side of the story as a victim. I just want to call somebody out here, MEP Claire Daly. She has been repeating the CCP's mouthpiece and disinformation about Uyghurs and denying anything wrong for the Uyghur people. So ever since I arrived in Dublin, when I heard this, I have been tagging her on the Twitter, asking her to meet with me, just to engage in conversation, just talk to me and listen to me about what's happening. But I did it a couple times and reminded her again last night, but she's just completely ignoring me. So come back to the question. Yes, it's extremely important to use the social media, but we really need to separate out what is the reality and what is there to just misusing the social media, brainwashing the people, and turning our youth against the government or values or everything that's being established and worked so hard from the generations, because they don't see what's hiding behind that. They don't see what's at stake here. When the Chinese government is conducting this genocide against the Uyghurs and silencing the entire world, using the corporations while they are using the Uyghur forced labor and making benefit out of the business with China and the trade, while we have feminists and the celebrities, social media influencers, they are so vocal against any kind of social injustice, rightfully. But they are silent against China's genocide. What does that mean? Are they just giving up their freedom of speech, or are they giving up the actual freedom and the democracy of this free world? So it's not just the Uyghurs' future is at stake, or Ukrainian people's future is at stake, or some atrocities in a different part of the world. The entire world's future, the freedom and democracy that we all worked so hard to establish, is at stake. If we don't speak out now, then the only voice left to speak will be one of regrets. Thank you.
Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, well, we're into politics here, rather than media regulation, although they're related, because there is a way in which political discourse is regulated, and it should. My just general point, it should apply in this arena, but. Let us make no mistake. Not only is the online material here, it's wonderful. I mean, it's far more plus than minus as far as I'm concerned, and it enables and allows the politics and political discourse, including if you want to criticise Claire Daly, she has to engage on that, and the gaining and loss of credibility that applies in any political discourse applies here. So I don't think we should be too pessimistic about this, but just how new it is, and how new it is particularly to people of my generation, and we've an awful lot to learn. Thank you.
So we should all become more proactive then in taking on new forms of social media to counter all this darkness that's prevalent in it as well. I think you will agree, ladies and gentlemen, that we've had a fascinating range of observations, insights, and experiences expressed by our panel. I'd like you to join me in thanking them most sincerely for the benefit of their knowledge and wisdom. And we're just right on time, and the wonderful aroma of wines and tapas is beginning to waft this way. So we have to conclude with the closing remarks for this marvelous symposium this morning. We have His Excellency Marcel Fortuna Beato, the Ambassador of Brazil, to address us. Thank you.
I begin by saying that I'll be very brief, because I'm tempted, just like everybody else, by the tapas and the wine. More seriously, to thank Ambassador de la Riva for hosting us and inviting me to the unenvious task of closing remarks. Just begin by thanking all the panelists who have shared a wealth of experience. I cannot but just to underscore what has just been said by Professor Weckler, and the richness, the variety, the challenging nature of what we have heard. Clearly, this debate is not possible to summarize, given its complexity, the multi-layered, the sophistication, but and even less come to conclusions. But I do think, and this has been said, that the seminar is truly very timely. It is clear by the complexity of the issues we have here that the questions that were posed about whether democracy and human rights are under threat, it's certainly not a rhetorical question. I think has been said again here that what we have seen in Dublin in the last few weeks has made it clear that these are real questions, that no society is immune, no matter its past track record and even its self-image. The risk is there. But even more important, the answer to both questions, I think, is not clear-cut. It is neither a definite yes or a flat no. Rather, I think it is conditional, and I think this was borne out by the debate, on our willingness to face up to the underlying problems. The rich debate, I think, has touched on a multiplicity of issues that are structural, that are global, they are political, they are psychological, human nature, the way the international system is organized, who's hegemonic, either at a political, a cultural, military level. But therefore, we are left with the fundamental question of what then to do. And I think that my starting point, and just to referring to the Declaration of Human Rights, is that, and this was said, that it is based on the idea that ultimately human individuals make decisions. But clearly this is not enough. We've learned that, and certainly we just this morning, is not enough what individuals want and believe. It is how we act collectively. So therefore the challenge is building shared values and goals. And ultimately, that can only be done in a very messy process that has to be democratic. Otherwise, we have very little chances of getting anywhere. So my fundamental point of view is just to insist that we must strive to balance the right to freedom of speech with the need to contain the spread of hate speech and fact-free conspiracy theories. There is a role for regulation. There is a role for fundamental fundamentally addressing the issues of economic destitution, social marginalization. But these, how do we bring them together? How do we bring the need for individual rights to be respected with collectively achieving commonality of objectives that allow us to translate into the practice? I think we've taken an interesting step this morning because the panelists have brought rich knowledge of experience spanning continents, cultures, and therefore is, I think, highly challenging and opens us to the fundamental question of how do we translate human rights and democracy into a global lingua franca that we can all share. Many issues were brought up. I think endless debates and future seminars can be arranged as a result. I would just like to end on a slightly positive note, myself, by saying that, and just recalling what Judge Gnatovsky was mentioning earlier today, that on the question of the crime of aggression and how the International Criminal Court has sort of veered off its course. I happen to have had the privilege and the honor of having been the head of the Brazilian delegation to Kampala, where we negotiated the typification of the crime of aggression. 3 weeks of very, very tough negotiations. In the end, we came up with a definition of the crime. It has not been enforced adequately, as we have seen. European attempts, I think, will equally find it challenging. But my final word is to say that in the end, at least we today have the certainty that certain individuals, certain dictators, cannot fly around the world as easily as they might have wished to. That must be a sign of inspiration and of hope that we can achieve things collectively if we at least continue to act. So my bottom line is thank you all for being here. I think we've made a significant contribution to a debate that is very, very much in its beginnings. And obviously, thank all those who have come from overseas to share their knowledge, their experience, and to enrich our experience here in Ireland. So I thank you all very much. And please, let's all enjoy the tapas and wine. Thank you very much.